Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Derek Notman. So I've been following his stuff on social media for a while. His background is in Chinese internal martial arts, the big three. We'll talk about what they are. Chinese healing arts and also Indian club swinging. So interesting guy, knows about a lot of things that I'm interested in but don't know much about. So genuinely sort of coming into this personally interested. So Derek, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here with you.
And what's the beginning of your journey with the body? Give us a little bit of biographical context here.
I was always a pretty active kid and loved sports. I grew up playing ice hockey, and that was a real passion for me. Then I got really into windsurfing, and that was another passion. And when I went off to college, I studied philosophy, and that really got me interested in embodiment and traditions and systems that had integration. So that led me into Chinese martial arts, because the idea that you had philosophical, medical, and movement-based practices that shared a common thread of philosophy and were a truly integrated system really captured my imagination when I was young. And that sort of led me on a long journey of travel and searching and studying, and led me all over the world and to many great teachers and experiences.
And let's sort of place this a bit geographically. Where did you grow up? Where are you now? Where did you go on the way? Let's hear a little bit about the sort of just the geography here.
Sure. So I grew up in Massachusetts, and I live on Martha's Vineyard, which is a beautiful island off the coast of Massachusetts. I went down to college in Florida, and after that, I wound up taking a year and traveling. So I've went from New Zealand to Australia, through Malaysia, Indonesia, up into Southeast Asia, all through Europe. During that time, I was looking for people to train with and study with, in particular within the three sister arts of Tai Chi, Xingyi, and Bagua. That was what really sort of captured my interest. I've lived a lot of places in the U.S. on that similar journey, trying to find different teachers. I'm 50 years old, and I've been doing this since I was 18. And back in the day, it just wasn't common. You couldn't find this stuff. It just wasn't available, and it wasn't around. So it sent me on a big journey looking for it. And then life has a sense of humor, right? And so when I moved back from Southeast Asia, I wound up living in Boston. And at this time, that would have been 2002. I shortly after, maybe it was a couple of years after I'd been back, I was introduced to a man from Shanghai who had recently moved to the United States, and he happened to be a lineage holder in an art called Xingyi Liu He Quan, which is a really cool old form of Chinese martial arts. And I was introduced to him through an acquaintance and became a disciple and student of his. His name is Shui Sheng Peng, and he was incredibly kind to me. I had a situation where I was able to train with him on a pretty much daily basis privately for about 3 years. And so he taught me.
That's quite a privilege in terms of really having that real student-teacher relationship and really being able to invest time in it.
Yeah, it was really it was special. I mean, it was for me. I had a practice doing healing work, and so I was working for myself, and so I had flexibility in my schedule. And he had come over here, and there was the economic crash, and so his work got a little bit dicey, and so we both happened to have free time, and really it was. We're still very close, and it's a great relationship. He basically, I had been and trained in China. I was training an art called Bagua Zhang, and I'd been at it for 15 plus years, and I thought I was pretty accomplished. And he kind of said, you don't know what you're doing. And I was like, oh, that hurts. But it was clear to me in seeing him that I didn't know what I was doing. So I kind of had to strip it all down to the ground level and relearn. And that was challenging, but the best thing I ever did. And it's impossible to learn what you think you already know. And so that was a real embodied lesson on that truth. And so through my practice with him, I really came to realize that Chinese martial arts is really about physical transformation. It feels to me like a lot of people within the community imagine there's a piece of intellectual information that they're going to come across that's going to somehow change their physicality.
Mm-hmm.
really it's about embodying the principles of the traditions, and that comes through a lot of hard work and a lot of clarity on what you're doing with the practice. So he really provided that for me, and that gave me a point from which to continue my studies and learning with a really solid basis.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of things you mentioned there I want to circle back around to. First is just like having time to study. Like one thing that occurs to me is just everyone I know's got busier and busier over the last, well, in my adult life, in the last 20 plus years. And I wonder if it's going to get to a point where people are just too busy and too distracted. There's so many distractions, so many cool possibilities to do that sort of old school training, whether it's a martial art or, yoga or something else. I wonder if there'd always be a slightly weird, small subsection of people that just make the time.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, it's clearly the case, right? We're all running ragged despite the promises of technology to liberate us and to give us more leisure time. We all seem to be doubling down our pace. It's what did Mark Twain say? Something to the effect that when a man has lost his way, he travels twice as fast, right? And feels to me like we're a little bit there. But, I think a lot of it, I think that's true. I would also say that, especially in relation to the Chinese martial arts, and I can only speak to my own experience, it's really hard to learn, even if you speak the language and understand it. But trying to study something out of the context of your own language makes it really hard because you project a lot onto it. And I know I certainly did that. And so for me, having a teacher in the flesh who was, the other beautiful thing about it was we had a language barrier. His English isn't very good and my Chinese isn't very good. So we really communicated through the body. He would literally put hands on me and mold me into positions. And so I didn't get to intellectualize it, which I have a tendency to do. I have a lot of air in my chart, if you believe in those things. And coming out of a philosophical background, I was just very prone to intellectualizing things. And so, I look at it this way. In America, in the United States, we don't have very good healthcare. So this is my healthcare. And my practice has led me to a place where I feel at 50 years old, very comfortable, very strong and healthy in my body. And so to me, the investment of time is worth the end goal. And, just quickly, the other thing is that really, if you have a clarity in a system and you put in 3 years of hard training, you should, at the end of those 3 years, be in a position to continue your practice for the rest of your life because you have a good foundation.
That's nice. It's nice to have some sense of 3 years of solid system and a solid practice, solid understanding. You could go to a yoga class for, 3 or 4 days a week for 4 years, and you'd be able to practice that yoga for the rest of your life. I hope, you'd have enough to do it safely, to have enough variations and things. So I think that maybe applies to other things too.
Sure.
The linguistic one's interesting because people think language is just a matter of the word translate sounds like you go directly from a thing to another thing that's exactly the same, just in different sounds,
Right.
And it's not like that, is it? Particularly with some, Chinese to English, for example, that's quite a big gap. Or Japanese, one word might contain a whole cultural concept that we could really spend a whole life studying and misunderstood very easily. So it's, even just little things like we translated all the embodied yoga principles poses into Russian. And then we found out that, for example, the word authority has an entirely different connotation in a society that had Stalin.
That's right.
Than in England. Authority in England means some nice teacher who, has some qualifications, whereas in Russia, it's this sort of terrifying power over your life's at risk threat. And so to directly translate with a good translator doesn't really cut it. So the language barrier is much more of a barrier than people think. It's not just you don't speak Chinese.
Totally agreed. And actually, one of the things that most fascinates me about this, and a big part of my work, is that the Chinese have a different map of the body. And although the map is never the territory, the map you have will determine the landmarks you look for. Mm-hmm. And so it creates a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you don't know to look for something, you'll never find it. But the whole Chinese method of developing the body is totally different from the West. in terms of, they didn't have a word for muscle. They talk about channels in the body. And so much of what we do in the West, there is a beautiful tradition of older European embodiment and physical culture, but it's sort of been lost. And actually, this is where clubs come in. But to stay with the Chinese point, the way the body is developed is totally different. And there's no hypertrophy, there's no ripping of tissues and all these things. And so a lot of the difference in the model fascinates me. And, obviously I'm biased, but I think that the model that the Chinese have of getting deeper into the body, in other words, you're not simply using weight and resistance to put a load on the body that it has to respond to by ripping and duplicating tissue or whatever that process that leads to hypertrophy is. You're actually creating the intention and the work with your mind and your feeling awareness. And from my standpoint, when you have a heavy weight or you're doing something that has a degree of danger and necessity to achieving it, there's so much noise in your nervous system and your focus is simply on achieving the goal because it's dangerous if you fail to. That's totally different than self-generating a degree of engagement through mindfulness and feeling awareness. And this is what the Chinese arts are about. You both, you are the creator of the intent or the degree of intensity to the practice rather than an external force.
And this is a very, how can I put this? It's a more subtle way of looking at any practice. And then instead there's a different map, and it's very literal Chinese medicine maps, for example. Mm-hmm. And in defense of the West, our physical anatomy has been much better than anything that's come out of the East. There just hasn't been good physical anatomy done in the East. So yeah. I've always been slightly suspicious and slightly concerned by the potential for fantasy and superstition in some of the Eastern maps.
Sure. Having got to live in Asia for several years, one of the things that I look at is look at the embodiment of our culture, right? We have this incredible detail and degree of knowledge, but on average, the physicality of your average American is pretty dreadful. And you go to the East, I've had teachers, and I continue to have teachers who are older men, and they're incredibly strong and robust. Yes. And so for me, the proof of the pudding is in the eating of it. And I think we've gotten a little lost in the minutia of detail and lost a sense of the holism of the organism, which is what we are. We're not pieces and parts. We're an integrated system.
And if we were to compare, we could say Eastern maps do have this wonderful emphasis on holism, this wonderful emphasis on sort of health and embodiment. And as you say, like actually putting it into action, into effect, the old guy going to the park to practice Tai Chi. I've seen this in Hong Kong and seen stuff in Singapore and going, wow, that's really in the culture in an impressive way. And that's definitely of value. And this idea of either splitting things up or being very goal orientated, or mechanical, I go to the gym and it's like, okay, I need to do 3 sets of 10 reps of a certain number of kilos. There's a very mechanistic, almost sort of factory-like way of approaching movement and exercise. And I get some of the sort of dehumanizing or unholistic aspects of that. But I also see a sort of, there's a lack of fantasy in that. It's like, okay, how many kilos can you lift? That's very physical. That's very measurable. And for better and for worse, that's been our obsession in the West.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's really important to have the rubber meet the road, right? And there's no greater community of people being lost in fantasy in some ways than Chinese martial arts. It's really, you have to be grounded in there, or it's really easy to get caught up in it. And because, for me, my interest is not in the martial art from the standpoint of fighting at this point. To me, it's simple. If you want to fight, you can fight. You join a mixed martial arts school, and that's what you're doing. And that's clear. And it's got great value to it, but it's also got a big downside to it because we have to grow older in these bodies. And what we do with them when we're younger determines how we live in them when we're older. And so for me, the attraction to the Chinese idea is this balance of being able to grow older and become comfortable and more skillful in your body. If you look at a guy like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was such an incredible physical specimen as a youth, he can't maintain that as he gets older.
Yeah.
And if you look at him now, all that muscle falls apart. But if you're putting the blood and energy into the bone and tendon, it doesn't deteriorate at the same level. And so from my standpoint, muscle is much more for steerage and directionality than for power. And the power should be coming from the bone and the tendon because it's the deeper substructures of the body. In a sense, it's like Chinese martial arts is about creating structures through alignment. And that alignment comes from being able to maintain a sustained degree of mindfulness where we're creating opposition throughout the body. It's like staking out a tent. The empty space that you get to sleep in comes from balanced lines of force in opposite directions. We need to do the same thing with the body to take the slack out of the body and create this connectivity and stretching throughout the entirety of the connective tissue and fascia around the skeletal system, the way the skin of a drum stretches around the frame.
Nice. I mean, it's a very different way of looking at strength and what generates strength. And, you know, when I've heard Chinese martial arts, when they talk about sinew and, you know, it's the partly about mind, and they'll talk about mind and spirit, and they'll talk about sinew a lot. And it's like, wow, there's a whole different approach to this.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's consistent within itself. And this is where my experience earlier in life, trying to figure all this out on my own, I couldn't get there. You know, I mean, you get something out of it, right? There's a lot of people, in my opinion, that are practicing internal martial arts in an external fashion. And it's fine. It's good exercise, but it's not the same thing. And I was lucky to get somebody who could literally point me right to it and let me feel on their body what they were doing and then really take the time. And you know, I have tremendous gratitude for that because it's not easy to teach this stuff. And it takes patience, and it's really a labor of love. But the type of physicality that it develops is very different. And so that whole map is really, you know, and this is where the philosophical nerd in me comes out, but like I'm fascinated by the idea of number and principle. And if you go back to Plato and Socrates and the pre-Socratics, you have this idea of how the body maps out. And the classical body that they were developing, if you look at the sculptures of ancient Greece, is very similar. It's not big hypertrophy. It's expanded structures and frames of the bones because muscle moves bone. And if you get deep enough into the muscle, you're actually able to manipulate your skeleton and start to expand it and open it. So you create volume in the thoracic cavity rather than simply loading muscle on top of it. A lot of time, people that have really big muscle development, they look a little bit squished in their frame. And so this is the opposite. We're building from the inside out as opposed to from the outside in.
Wonderful. And you've used a couple of terms and said a couple of things that may be useful for listeners to map out because, you know, imagining most people here aren't Tai Chi practitioners or whatever. Internal and external. And sometimes they hear about, you know, hard and soft martial arts used either synonymously with those or used differently from those. So how would you define an internal martial art compared to an external?
That's a great question. I define internal martial art or internal movement as moving within the space of your own body as opposed to simply moving your body through space.
Okay, so you're talking about physical things still. So it might be subtle changes to balance, expansion, contraction.
Yeah, and the ability to, and this is again where it starts to get a little bit intangible, but it's actually very tangible. It's the ability to use the mind to direct the body into opposition. So you hear the word center a lot, hara, dantian, all these kinds of things. It's sort of a mystical thing within these traditions. Well, the center is a real thing to be developed, but we have to find the center. And by definition, you can only find the center by knowing the endpoints. And in the body, we have endpoints. We have a head and a tail, and we have hands and feet. And by learning to use the mind to stake out these oppositions, we stretch through the whole body and we begin to define center through this constant recognition of the endpoints. So in Tai Chi, one of the big skills is to get the Qi out to the ends so that you're full. This comes from the practice and the transformation of the tissue, because the tissue becomes soft and elastic so that it can be stretched around the bones and directed through this idea of mentally directed oppositions. If I take my chin and tuck it and raise the crown of my head, and at the same time drop my tail and tuck it in opposition, I stretch out the length of my spine. If I can maintain that, I have, quote unquote, strung the bow. And when that bow is strong, it has an elasticity to it. So when pressure is put upon it, I can absorb that pressure and then release it simply through the natural elasticity of the bow that I've created.
Okay, and this is one of the things I have in China martial arts is tricky, is the constant use of analogy. Yeah. And in the West, we're quite clear about the difference between analogy and reality. And unless we want to get very philosophical or postmodern, there's a clear distinction. Whereas I find particularly with Chinese, there's a moving backwards and forwards between those two things, which for me is often quite frustrating when I'm trying to sort of get to okay, what's this? What do you actually mean by qi? Because there'll be, is it a physical force? Are you simply talking about how we use our attention, which is, of course, useful and interesting and powerful? Is it something that flows through us like electricity or water? Some people seem to conceptualize it that way. And then there's all these analogies fucking thrown in. And I'm left just going, what the hell do you mean?
Yeah, no, I totally feel you. And from my standpoint, it's simple. We are in qi the way a fish is in water. A fish doesn't know it's in water until you take it out of water. A human being doesn't realize, health is mostly appreciated in its absence. I believe that what happens is through a state of subconscious contraction over time, the body becomes tight and locked down. This makes it so we don't receive the life force that's all around us because the closed hand can't receive. So a big part of Chinese martial arts is simply about learning to recognize and release the subconscious tension that visits us every day. Life is inherently stressful. So we have to consciously learn to recognize the tension and release it over and over and over.
You just did the exact thing that drives me nuts. You mixed in about 3 or 4 different models simultaneously and a couple of metaphors while you're at it. So do you conceptualize that there is a physical energy around us which we somehow can get more skillful at?
Yeah, it's the animating force of all life. Whatever makes all this happen, this is the energy. Life itself is coming from something, and we don't get to know what that is, in my opinion. It's a mystery, right? But whatever the animating force is, the difference between a soma and a corpse, right? Soma is the word from Hesiod for the living body.
Sure.
Corpus was the Greek word for a dead body. That distinction, whatever it is qi.
I mean, a Western materialist mindset would say, no, the distinction is one is moving, one is chemically active, one is electromagnetically active, but the other isn't.
But that movement is life force, in my opinion. That's qi. So, I mean, for me, exactly what it is doesn't matter to me so much. It's not some mystical energy. It's simply anytime we move, we generate energy, right? Energy is movement. And so Chinese medicine, the idea is, how do you become healthy? You create the conditions in which health wants to manifest. You feather the nest. You make a place that invites life in. Whereas if you're constantly tight and uncomfortable, if you have negativity all the time, these aren't really conditions that lead to life in a certain sense. So we're trying to align with these larger forces and principles. And I certainly don't know the answer, but it seems pretty clear to me that the same thing that makes a tree grow is what's making my heart beat. I have no idea what it is, but I want to be in alignment with it.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle when you go to sort of such big analogies there, but I probably would agree with all the conclusions in terms of sort of, what might be wise from a health point of view. And there's clear health benefits to when you see those old guys in the park doing Tai Chi, you're like, okay, they're doing something that's healthy there. There's some proof in the pudding, as it were.
Yeah, and for me, it's all tangible, right? It's harder to talk about this as we are. If we were in the room, it would be much easier to show you. And so for me, as old, I'm more flexible, I'm more comfortable, I'm stronger, I have better energy. My tendons are thick. You can see that. Like there's real physical things that come from it. Like my teachers, you feel their bodies and it's like, what the hell's going on? And I haven't seen that in the West. And I think it's due to the map. Again, if you're not trying to create this, it's not just going to happen on its own. And, I do tend to be more philosophical and poetic than materialistic. And so I'm not so sure that a lot of the reducing down and looking for mechanism that we're so keen on in the West is getting us any closer to solving the riddle of life, right? So I don't think it's something that we can actually ever really approach. And so when I look at physical culture, one of the things that's clear to me, as long as there have been people have been wondering how they got here and how do they stay here and live well. So I don't think these are modern considerations.
Sure. I mean, there's it's not I'm against poetry. I'm against mixing it with mechanics. That's my issue, is the mixing of them. And the Chinese martial artists are the people I know who are most guilty of that. But others do it too. And it's not that I want to live in a prosaic world, or I think there's no value in seeing things kind of metaphorically, or as you say, in some ways it doesn't matter. In some ways you just go, okay, is this study, however it's explained, does it have health benefits for others that might inspire me? Does it have benefits for me over time that encourage me to continue? I mean, ultimately, that's what really matters, not how well you understand it technically.
That's right. And because an explanation is never going to be the phenomena anyway. So all we can do is try and put it in a container that is shareable. And because the Chinese do tend toward a very poetic view of the world, their map has this quality to it, And so like Tai Chi, for instance, everybody thinks that Tai Chi, or not everybody, but a common understanding is that it's this choreography, it's this series of movements, the form. But really, Tai Chi is a philosophy, and it's talking about the nature of duality and how all objects that exist in time and space exist in relationship to their opposite. And all movement is a wave between these two polarities. And so you're trying to find center as that wave rises and falls and maintaining that. So Tai Chi is really a embodied philosophy and a series of principles that you practice. The form is just a container to practice those principles so you can embody them over time. But it's not about the form. And so like I talk about club swinging and Tai Chi interchangeably because they're both about uninterrupted, interconnected circles.
Yeah. Quick break to tell you about our program. So as well as the podcast, we have various kinds of online training. So we have the Embodied Yoga Principles online training, as well as in-person training. Embodied Yoga Principles for yogis who want to get yoga off the mat, specialize in the psychology of yoga, unique postures. It's a 5-day training. We have one in Brighton, one in Berlin, and one in Austin, Texas. So if you go to Embodied Yoga Principles, you can find them. Also the online version of the training for people who can't make those dates. Excellent courses. The Embodied Yoga Principles training for the yogis. For the coaches and facilitators, we have the Embodied Facilitator course. This is our flagship course. We offer it in Moscow, also in the UK. A 9-month adventure, real deep dive into embodiment. It's the biggest embodiment program I do. It could be like movement people who want to work in business more. We have people like dancers and martial arts teachers come to learn more about working in mainstream settings, but also for coaches and trainers who want something really well structured, who want to work on themselves, who want to learn practical tools, learn how to work with the body in facilitation. If you can't make EFC, and it is a big ask, there's an online course we run called the Foundations of Embodiment Certification. So if you go to Embodied Facilitator, you'll find the in-person, and then dash FEC, F-E-C, F for Freddy, E-C for Charlie, FEC, you'll come up with the Foundations of Embodiment Certification, and also do one-day events all around the world. So I'm just about to do a tour to Slovenia, Berlin, Copenhagen, Brussels, Amsterdam, and Brighton. The Brighton one is £10, which is like $15. So if you're coming from abroad, that could make that affordable. The Brighton one's always like a really big fun one, so that's coming up. Again, go to the Embodied Facilitator course to see all of these events. And we have a little online evening as well. If people just want a taster, again, that's £10. That's a 3-hour thing coming up as well. Embodiedfacilitator.com, embodiedfacilitator.com, and you'll find all those events or Embodied Yoga Principles for the yoga ones. Okay, so that's the stuff that I sell. Oh, and the book, the embodiment book. If you want to get my book and learn about embodiment through reading, you can also get the embodiment book available at Amazon and no good bookstores. So there we go. Excuse the interruption, and back to the episode. And this is really the genius of the East, which, while I regard Western civilization as the one I want to live in and superior to all others in every way, one of the absolute gifts of the East, as far as I can see it, that the West didn't really come up with was the idea of a philosophical system that was also a praxis. So, for example, the Greeks had some wonderful philosophical systems, but as far as we know, there's no sort of surviving Greek physical culture that went along with that, and a medical, the combination of a martial, medical, and philosophical culture, which, as you said, as a young person, gripped you. I mean, that is a really strange and wonderful idea, that those things being combined. Like, no one's doing philosophy in the gym. You don't go to LA Fitness and see people quoting Kant.
That's right. Yeah,
that's a hell of a thing. It's a hell of a thing.
Yeah, and I think the Greeks had it. I think it got destroyed. I mean, China was so insular for so long that they're probably the best intact model of it. But Socrates and Plato, they wrestled. They were athletes, and the veneration of physicality in the body is all over Greek philosophy and writings and all this stuff. And so, I personally think that physical culture really is the gemstone of humanity in a certain sense. It's how people music and dance and food and medicine. This is how we take the situation of being here and we do something beautiful with it. And to me, I really lament the sort of death of that and the movement away from it. We've become so culturally disembodied, and it's because we don't really value these things, and we've gotten so fixated on trying to figure out what everything is, and we've sort of become too clever by half, right? Where, again, everybody's running pillar to post these days despite all these advances in technology. And so at some point you have to step back and look to see, where's the bus actually going, and do you want to go there?
Yeah, I mean, we lost our native psychotechnology essentially in the West. If the Greeks had a psychotechnology of change rather than just simply philosophy, if they had a sort of, if their gymnasium, which wasn't just a physical gymnasium, as you say, was a philosophical gymnasium, if that was a really integrated approach, that was somehow lost. And as we took the intellectual as the kind of key one, and now we find ourselves, with this huge technology, all the information in the world at our hands, at our fingertips, but sort of impoverished when it comes to actually our actual daily life and our well-being.
Yeah, and a lot of it, well, I mean, not to go down a rabbit hole, but a lot of it is, in China, a lot of physical culture was about empowering the Chinese people who saw themselves isolated and at odds with the rest of the world. And in a lot of ways, I think these traditions are weakened to, it weakens a people, right? If you don't have a sense of yourself, if you don't have a sense of a culture, if you don't have purpose, it's really easy to drift about. And so, I see it all as pretty connected. And one of the things that interests me is in the world of movement, and I'm going to make rough assertions here, but there's the world of somatics and embodiment and all these things where people are spending a lot of time on the touchy-feely ends of it, but maybe not working quite as hard physically. And then you have people that are working really hard, but maybe not bringing these other really powerful technologies in through the intellect and feeling awareness. And so there's a real gap there. And I think that things are meant to go together. And you see that wrestling is one of the greatest examples of this. Wrestling promotes a real grounded physicality in a very different type of a body than what we see from just sort of pushing weights. And there's a lot of, and again, this is within the club swing, the Persian tradition in Iran is beautiful and it's very much intact. And it has to do with bringing poetry and spirit together with physicality. So we can become vessels. We can become, worthy in a certain sense through purification, through practice.
So the club swinging tradition, then, I've seen videos of you doing this. It looks kind of fun and cool, and these kind of big, people might imagine sort of like big clown clubs, but very heavy. And some of them are more like sort of battle maces or something. And you're moving them around in these kind of fluid ways. Say a little bit about, paint that picture for us, like what that is, and is it like an alternative form of weight training? Is it a philosophical system? Why might someone swing clubs?
Well, it's super fun, but it's a tradition. It's actually one of the oldest forms of physical culture, and it comes out of warfare. And so basically in India and Iran are the two places where really the root of it is. This is how they would train soldiers, because, if you're on the battlefield, and this is an interesting thing for me recently, is, I always imagined kind of foolishly, and you see this in Chinese, that you have these really intricate, very athletic sword movements and things. But on the battlefield, you have no room. You have a shield. You're carrying all this heavy stuff. People are pushing against each other. It's not a super skillful exchange. It's a power exchange. And if your hands and arms get tired from swinging your sword and shield, you're going to die. And so in Iran, in Persia, they were at war with the Romans for 800 years, right? And so this is how they would train in the off time to be battle ready. And so the swinging of clubs is magical in a lot of ways. And one is human beings. What makes us unique is both our verticality, our upright relationship to things, and our hands. Our hands are how we create the world around us. So club swinging allows us to manipulate objects and build very strong hands, which then reference back in through the body, because all of the meridians terminate in the hands and feet. And so in Chinese, we say if the hands and feet get good blood flow, the qi is full and everything else is going to be healthy. So club swinging is a great way to develop physicality. It's a great way to develop spatial awareness, because you're swinging heavy things around your head. And because of the fulcrum effect and the leveraging, it builds a different kind of strength. It's not muscle ripping, it's tendon stretching. And for me, it's all about sustaining posture and being able to take force into the body and redirect it, just like Tai Chi. When I'm swinging, I'm not a very big person, but I can swing pretty heavy clubs because of my alignment. I'm not upholding the weight. I'm letting the weight pass through my bones by taking it down through my structure. And so you organize around your own central vertical axis as well as the central vertical axis of the clubs. So you're moving in relation to an object, which gives you direct feedback.
The nearest thing I tried to it, and it might be totally different, so tell me if it is, was kettlebell swinging, where it's strength training, but it's also training in not isolating the bicep or one. Normally you're going with whole chains when you kettlebell swing. And you're also, it's skill training. You're learning to be more efficient. So part of what happens when you work with kettlebells is that over time you get heavier kettlebells, not because you get stronger, but you just get more relaxed and more skillful at using your body, which is not something the average sort of machine in a gym is helping you do.
Yeah, I think there's a real parallel there. You see clubs starting to come into those communities, so they're sort of the early adapters of it. I don't have a lot of experience with kettlebells, but I have played with them a bit, and I think there is a similarity there. I also think there's a difference, and that has to do with the length of the club and how it acts as a lever. The longer the lever, the more the point of connection has to be really strong and engaged. And so definitely similar practices, but there is a difference. And I'm not qualified enough with kettlebells to really relate the two. But I think what you're saying is spot on. And part of what I really like about the club swinging, and in Chinese martial arts, we say you want to stand in the bones, move through the joints, and lead with the mind. And this is the same thing with the club swinging. You are using the movement and the energy created by swinging the club to stretch the connective tissue in the body. And one of the really valuable things is if I hold my body still when I swing my clubs and I don't allow a lot of wobbling and compensation, it forces the joints to create the movement. And so that piece is huge, because now all of a sudden you are directing energy through the movement inside your body. And that is really how you're able to stretch a lot of the connective tissue. And so there's a method to it. It's like Tai Chi, all these things, like yoga, for instance. If I say, oh, what do you practice? And somebody says yoga, it doesn't tell me anything.
Right.
Like, what do you do? Oh, I work. Of course you work.
Yeah, stuff. I mean, yeah. So if people wanted to see this, then is it Indian club swing, Persian club? What should they be sort of Googling to check this stuff out?
there's three main traditions. The Indian tradition and the Persian tradition are the two root traditions, and those cultures have a lot of similarity there. In Persia, they call clubs meals. In India, they have a few different names. Karlakati, Jori, and Mugdar are the common ones. But what happened was when the British colonized India, they saw all the Indian soldiers playing with or swinging clubs, and they started to adopt it. And it came back to the UK in the Victorian era, and it became a huge thing. It was in the Olympics for a couple of years. You can see all these old pictures online of women in like Elizabethan era dresses swinging clubs. It was a huge craze. And so the traditions are, really the Indian, the Persian, and the Victorian. But if you Google Indian club swinging, you will see it. And what you'll often see along with it is people swinging heavier clubs, which are usually called meal or joris, and maces, which are often called gada. And they're related practices. But what's really nice is it's first of all, it just feels really good. It opens the body, and it really, for me, I've been swinging clubs for over a decade, but for me before it was always a ancillary practice to my martial arts. It was just, I've studied a lot of things in my attempt to understand Chinese martial arts. In the last 3 years, clubs have become sort of my main practice. And in that time, it's totally transformed my torso. It's gotten rid of some tendency to be more kyphotic. It's really developed a lot of strength and a lot of comfort in my body. And I really believe it's because, again, muscle moves bone. And if we get deep enough into the layer of the muscle where it's connecting, we can start to move our bones. This is what contortionists do, right? They're able to actually move deeper within the joints. And so this is also part of the whole Chinese idea, is getting deeper into the core of the body and moving from there rather than moving at the surface levels of the body. And clubs, being a lever, allow us to do this. It's like Archimedes said, if you give me a long enough lever, I could move the world. So the more length in the lever, the more it connects into the point of contact and pulls at the body.
I have to say, I just watched a few videos ahead of this, and I had just had one on while we're talking, actually, just a video of you swinging, just to kind of get a physical sense of it, because we can't see each other on the screen today. And it looks fun. It looks just like the boy in me wants to sort of swing heavy things around, and there's something about just sort of power moving through you, and there's a sort of a bit of a flow to it that you don't see with just lifting weights up and down in the same way.
Absolutely. It's super fun. And almost everybody that I've put a pair of clubs in their hand that's done a class loves it. They feel great after. It's not so complicated. I've been trying to teach very complicated things to people for a long time, and that's not easy. And clubs are, to me, a bridge. It allows me to teach this deeper body method of Chinese martial arts, but in bite-sized pieces that are immediately available to people, rather than having to sit there in a standing meditation posture, which is a real challenge for Westerners. This has activity. And in a sense, you have two traditions, right? You have finding the movement within stillness, like in standing meditation, and then you have finding the stillness within movement, which is what club swinging is. It's an active, dynamic meditation. And because you're repeating these things over and over, you're dropping into it deeper and deeper. And the three qualities in Chinese martial arts that we develop are Ting, which is the ability to listen, to feel, Song, which is the ability to release the tension that we recognize through the listening, and then Yi, the ability to direct and lead the body with the mind, because we've cleared out the communication gaps which were stuck tension.
Wonderful. I mean, I have to say, having tried just a little bit of Tai Chi, and we're talking like maybe 10, 20 lessons, it wasn't much fun. I found it really hard work. There's a very different learning curve than something like yoga, where you might get it might be you're stretching and you feel good afterwards. And, I could basically do that. But Tai Chi, I just felt stupid, and it was mentally difficult and physically difficult in a way I didn't expect. Yeah. And, there isn't that Western thing of, I've had a workout, afterwards even. And I can see why this isn't that popular. Would you think Tai Chi would ever be? I mean, obviously in certain areas, and maybe when I'm older, it'd be the only thing I can do, and I can no longer go to Systema or whatever. But there's a do you think it would ever take off in a way, the internal martial arts, in the same way as yoga has, for example? Because you'd think, it's not sexy, it's not cool. Why isn't it quite as big as yoga?
Well, I think everything you just said is true. It's hard. I mean, if I was just fixated on it. For some reason, it just fascinated me. And it took me many years to get it. And of course, I don't have it, right? It's a constant. One of the things I like about club swinging and Tai Chi is you're pursuing harmony. You're pursuing an idea that you can never arrive at. And because of that, it's a constant progression of moving forward. It's like if you're trying to run a 4-minute mile, you get it, and then then you try to go faster. That bottoms out. Whereas when you're in pursuit of an intangible idea, and let's never forget that the world is driven by intangible ideas, that kind of thing has a constant growth to it. And club swinging is the same thing. Every swing, you're looking for, how could I have this be more harmonious? How could I be less involved? How could I have it be easier? And so Tai Chi, I think, has got a lot of challenges in getting out into the public, especially what I would call proper Tai Chi, because again, it's not just the form, and it takes a lot of physical changes that can be uncomfortable. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, in yoga, you could say the growth of yoga, was it really yoga that grew it all, or something else that's being called? There's a lot of distortion and issues with what's happened in that tradition as far as I'm concerned.
Sure. Maybe it's a sort of exercise version of it, and it opened the door to other things. And I just want to underline an interesting difference. You said that in the Tai Chi or the club swinging, and I definitely say this of other martial arts I've studied, that the pursuit of sort of ever ease, ever grace, creativity, maybe in some. There's other aims other than simply how heavy a thing can I lift, or how fast can I go, or how fancy can I look. There's a subjective quality of grace that's being sought, and that gives a whole nother goal, if you will, to the practice other than the external goal.
Yeah, totally. And in a certain sense, and this is a little bit abstract, but it's the closest label I can come to it, you develop a knowing. You develop a sense of, there's a quality to the movement that starts to build. And in a sense, club swinging is all about working with geometry. You're dealing with circles and the diameters of circles. And so just like an artist who sits and tries to draw a perfect circle, they may draw 10,000 circles. They never get a perfect circle, but their drawing and their ability to draw a circle gets better and better and better. And so Tai Chi and swinging clubs are very much in that same school. There's an aesthetic component. There's a harmony that you're looking for that starts to pervade the activity. And if you think about human bodies, we generate feeling. So if I'm engaged in an activity that feels really good through the doing of it, I'm creating so much good chemistry in my body. And so a lot of the health benefits, I believe, are a function of this type of relationship. We learn how to generate our own medicine through the practice. And I really do think that constriction, whether it's an economy, a human body, or a roadway, the lack of circulation is what causes problems. And so practices that allow us to get the ebb and flow of movement out to the extremities and back to the core over and over again create the conditions for health, because that seems to be what life wants to do. There's this ebb and flow, this gathering and releasing over and over.
Nice. The aesthetic one's interesting because for example, in Aikido, I saw people who really got this and people who semi-got it. They'd say things like, it doesn't feel that good to do it this way. Like they'd have some sense of the subjective quality of their own aesthetic experience of it. Others who were really orientated around that, and others who were just totally uninterested in that. And you'd see the real spectrum. And it seemed to me there was always something a bit missing if people were not including the aesthetic. And I don't mean the external aesthetic of how does it look. There's a whole school of Frenchy Aikido, which always looks very fancy and smooth. But the ones who, to me, seem to be pursuing something interesting were the ones who were paying attention to the quality of how good it felt as an indicator of its health impact on themselves and their partner, and the whether the power is really flowing well. So actually there's an impact on the kind of actual martial effectiveness of something and all the rest of it.
That's right. And whether it's Aikido or pushing hands in Tai Chi or swinging clubs, what you're looking to do is get out of the way without running away or resisting. You're simply redirecting the flow of energy through a circular movement out and away. So it's like, for me, one of the reasons I started swinging clubs was I moved and I didn't have any students to really be pushing hands with. And so I got into swinging clubs and I realized, wait a minute, it's exactly the same thing. I'm simply attaching, adhering, joining, and following the movement of the club. And, we were talking a little bit about objective measurement before. And one of the things that I also really like about clubs is that you try to pick up a 10-pound club and swing it. If you've never done it before, it's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. So there's a skill that goes along with learning how to do it, as well as a development. Because as you swing more and more, you develop the strength to stabilize the club and to manipulate it. And you have to have your mental awareness or your feeling awareness transcend your body and go out through the club. So in other words, when I'm holding the club, I'm feeling beyond my own physical body's limit and endpoint out through the club, just like you would a sword or any other weapon. It's not unique to clubs, but that is a capacity of human beings that's really special and unique. And swinging clubs gives us a chance to really develop it, in your spatial awareness, your sense of where you are really starts to come to. So it's, for me, all these things are kind of the same thing. And it's really about learning to recognize where we're holding on, where we're not in harmony with ourselves. And again, the advantage of a club is that because you're relating to an object other than yourself that is following the demands of geometry, you find the corners, you find the turbulence and the places that aren't smoothed out, and it gives you a chance to let go so they smooth out.
Nice. Listen, Derek, we're sort of moving towards a close here. We have a little time still, though. Is there anything you haven't talked about that you'd like to talk about, or maybe misunderstandings about the internal arts? Or actually, I've got one before you do. We've got a bit of time. So could you briefly say about the other two internal martial arts? Because Tai Chi is the sort of the three siblings, Tai Chi is the massively more famous one. Could you just kind of mention the other two as well? I think our listeners would probably learn something there.
Yeah, so in order of creation, right, you have the oldest sister is Xingyi Luhe Chuan, which is the art that I was able to study with my Sifu, which literally means, again, I don't speak Chinese, but this is how I interpret it, is integrating the heart and the mind through the 6 harmonies. And Xingyi Luhe Chuan is based off of what they call the Sheda Sheng, or the 10 big shapes, which are representative of 10 animals. And the idea is to integrate the body through the 6 harmonies, which are defined as the hands and the feet, the elbows and the knees, and the hips and the shoulders all move together. Those are the Wei San Ha, or the external harmonies. Then you have the Nei San Ha, the internal harmonies, which are the heart and the mind and the breath and the strength. So Xingyi Luhe is, of the 3, the most physically demanding and aggressive, you could say. It's like the short, straight path up the mountain. Xingyi Luhe is the oldest, and it's traditionally from the Hui Muslim people, and it wasn't taught commonly at all until a guy named Lu Songgao started teaching it in Shanghai around the time of the Japanese invasion. I'm not a historian either, but I have rough facts around it. And that was my teacher's teacher's teacher. So I was very lucky to get a clear line within that art. The next one was Tai Chi, and then, which everybody knows about, so I won't say much about. And then you have Bagua, which is the newest of these arts. And Bagua has more, is very similar, except for it's based to moving around a circle. And you have within all these arts the commonality within the, I study all 3 traditions. So I study Xingyi with my Xingyi Luhe teacher, and then I study Tai Chi and Bagua with another teacher of mine, Yang Yu-sen. And all 3 arts share this idea of tendon development and building structure. And the point of building the structure is to be able to relax into it. It's like water. If you don't have a container to put it in, it just goes everywhere. So one of the most common errors in Tai Chi is everybody tries to just relax and flow. But relaxing and flowing is built on having a structure to relax into and having clarity in the geometry so things can actually flow. And so that's one of the challenges, is that people, if you're going to learn the art, the first thing you do is counterintuitively not what you think you're going to do. It's a lot of building of structure as opposed to flowing movement. And you see this in clubs too, whereas people's attempt to flow in skipping the building of something that's actually able to flow leads to this kind of no man's land in the middle, in my opinion. And so the commonality between the three sister arts is the internal methodology, what I call the interconnected body method. This has to do with unifying the three sections of the body. The three sections of the body are the legs, the torso, and the arms. From the waist down, you have earth. From the waist up, you have heaven. And then the arms are humanity. Each one of these sections of the body contains three subsections, right? You have the hip joint, the knee joint, the ankle. You have the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist, and you have the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. So those represent the 9 joints. And the idea is to be able to organize these 9 joints so that they're all connected as a single unit, so that when force comes in, it's dissipated and distributed across the whole frame of the body. And when force is released, you get the compounding effect of each section. And so this is what these arts have in common. They build a particular type of physicality. The way they do it varies a little bit, but there's more in common than different, in my opinion.
Great. Well, that was a very comprehensive answer, Derek. I appreciate that. It's going to be one of those ones I listen back to on the podcast, and I'm not kind of interviewing and go, right, okay. And I get a lot out of a second listen when speakers have been informed as you are. I found your answers very clear, and you've clearly got a wealth of knowledge here. I'll definitely look you up if I'm ever in town. If you're ever in the UK, I'd love to swing some clubs with you. That looks like a lot of fun. So, do you have a closing message about the body, Derek?
Well, I think we have to keep in mind that we're not our bodies, but we're also not our bodies. And it's, as long as we're going to be here, we're going to be here in these bodies. And so it's worth the time and energy to build it out. It's like a car. You're not your car, but it's nice to have a nice one. And so I think that really is important. And I also feel like the body is the filter of all of our experience. And if we're not comfortable in our body, it's going to really mitigate how comfortable we can be in our experience of life. And so comfort is the ultimate luxury, and there's no place more immediate to be comfortable than in our own skin.
Nice. Derek, thank you so much for joining us today.
Mark, thanks so much. It's always a pleasure. And
Derek, I've forgotten to give you a plug. I'm a horrible host. Where can people find you on the internet? Where do they go to look at your stuff?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So my website is dereknotman.com, and that's currently under some development, but it's there. And then I run Island Physical Culture on Facebook and Instagram.
Great. And as I said, I've been watching your social media, often find it sort of little bite-sized chunks of things that make me go, oh, what's that? And think, and it's a nice break from the Instagram girls, so I appreciate
it. Thanks so much, Mark. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for your time, Derek.
All right. Be good.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So please go there. On the embodyfacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. Most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodyfacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodyfacilitator.com website, There's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you. Until next time, welcome home to the body.